Okay, so I'm back doing another landscape tutorial. If you're familiar with my other tutorials, you'll know that I use Procreate as an app, and within Procreate I've just opened an A4 canvas. I'm going to be mainly using the soft and medium airbrushes, although later on I'm probably going to be using this turpentine brush setting as well. But to begin with, I'm just going to start with the soft airbrush. Now in terms of the colours that I'm going to be using, I have created a palette here. So this is my colour scheme. These colours have associated hexadecimal codes, which is found in here in the value section of the colours. So these codes are down in the description on this video, and you can just type them into here and then start to construct your own palette. So you'll be able to use exactly the same colours that I'm using myself. So I've tried to order the colours in the kind of order that you might actually want to use them in this video, or I'm planning to use them at least. There may be some slight changes as we go along, but I'm pretty sure that these are going to be the colours that I'm going to use. So the first thing we're going to do is start to assemble some of the colours for the sky. So I've got 3 different blues here to give me the full range of colours that I'm going to use. And again, I'm on a soft airbrush. I'm going to make the brush quite sizable, maybe turn the opacity of the brush down somewhat. And I'm just going to lay in some of that colour at the top. So this is going to be the darkest of the blue that I'm going to use on the sky. The majority of it is, however, going to be lighter. So I'm just going to mix those two together. Obviously I'm using a mixture of not full opacity, but also pencil pressure. So I'm not pressing on fully. And that means that perhaps I can fade these together, more successfully. If I was just pressing on full, you wouldn't get any blend. I'm using a light touch to blend them together. And if you're still not happy with the way that they've blended, go back over with the colours, add more of the mid-tone in, just try and blend them in better together. Can be a quite frustrating part of the image here, and I know certainly in the past that I've obsessed about trying to get those transitions nice and smooth. Having said that, if you really have struggled, then there is an easy option, and that is just to use the Gaussian blur, which is up here in the adjustments, and then you can just slide that along and it should blend them in better for you. If you feel that you've extended that blur down too much, you can then just in the section here, just the transform sort of tool, you can then condense it down into a smaller area as well. So that'll do for my sky to begin with. And the next thing we're going to do is create another layer, and I'm going to create something of a kind of mountain range. It's not going to be the foreground feature, it's going to be more of a background element. So because it's quite far away, it's not really going to venture outside of the blue tones that I've created here. So I've come up with some slightly different blues than I've created for the sky, just so that it doesn't seem too much like the sky background, but they are quite similar. So again, I'm going to start with the first blue. This time I'm going to change to the medium airbrush. I do want it to be a little sharper for the top of the mountain range, and I'm not going to turn it up to full opacity, but we're going to get it fairly close to that. Now I'm just trying to visualize where I want the horizon line. I don't want it halfway, I want it a bit lower than that. So let's just pencil it in here. You can even draw a wobbly line like this, hold it at the end, and it will snap to a straight line. Not that you're going to see this line at all, but it just gives you a sense of where you're working from for your horizon. So probably to begin with, I'll begin with some shapes, a rough mountain range in the background. I'm really not going to worry too much about this. I'm going to obviously further refine this. Doesn't matter if you let go a couple of times and start to piece it in quite roughly. Being deliberately quite scruffy with this. Most of this, not all of it certainly, but quite a good chunk of this is going to be obscured by the trees that are going to go in front of it anyway, so you don't need to be too precious about this at all. I suppose the only thing that you need to maybe spend a little bit of time on is just getting that top edge, create some interesting features or some mounting tops, some spikes. I've done a couple of tutorials. If you want to look through my playlist, I have done a couple of tutorials on scenes with mountains in. They are kind of really fascinating forms, obviously, because they're so massive. And I will keep returning to them as a subject matter just because they are really interesting. And they do appear in a lot of interesting landscapes. Really epic sort of scenes, you'll find mountain ranges. So there's a little bit of repetition. But then I guess there's only so many things that you'll typically find in a landscape anyway. So you're going to have trees, you're going to have clouds, you're going to have mountains, those types of things really. Now one of the comments that I had on my last landscape tutorial is that there were no trees. So I'm really going to go to town on adding some trees in true Bob Ross style. I'm going to add loads of happy trees in this scene. So I'm going to go to the opposite end of my colour spectrum, or the colours that I've selected for the mountains. So this colour is not quite white, but it's near as damn white, and I'm going to use it quite sparingly, but it's going to be used to get some features in here that perhaps obviously show snow on the mountains. So I'm not going to get zoomed in. I'm still using the medium airbrush. Don't need to go any sharper than that because I've turned the size of the brush down. So I'm adding some features here that would be perhaps snow in the scene. I'm going to reserve this mainly for the real high sections on the mountain range. Some bits are going to be directly in sunlight. Perhaps we've got a kind of cloudy sky in which some bits of light rather break through and actually cause a real white area on the mountain edge, on the mountain side. Making sure that I have certain shapes, so we're going to have a sense of maybe the snow texture sort of sliding down the edge of the mountain there, so it goes with the shape of the mountain somewhat. But other than that, you want a real broken kind of texture on there. So I can go to another blue now. So you notice I've got 4 different colours here. I've got the white, I've got a very pale blue. So I'm going to add some of the pale blue now. So there's going to be some bits of snow perhaps that are still at the top, but they're not in the same extent of direct sunlight. So they're going to be a little bit more blue. Again, I'm concentrating them near the top of the mountain. It's obviously going to be colder still up there. Quite broken texture. You don't want it too uniform. There'll be some bits where there's really not much sign of snow, so you can leave it quite dark, and then other bits where you're going to cluster lots of blobs and textures to represent snow. So the way I'm imagining the light source is probably coming more from maybe above, maybe just sort of passing through onto certain sections here. Again, so I can go back to my white. Maybe there's just a section similar to the way they've got it here that's just catching more of that white area, catching more of the snow in that area. There might just be a few bits on this one. It's not perhaps as high up as that mountain, but still it's going to have some of the whiter parts just here and there. Switch between your blues. So we've not got the lightest blue, we've got the next blue along, so I'm going to use that now, and I'm going to perhaps just start adding some blocks. Maybe you get more of the snow sort of collecting into bigger areas. Keep it quite scribbly though, keep some gaps. Now I've kind of explained in the previous tutorial that this kind of texture work it's difficult to explain sometimes. I don't like using brushes that do all the work for you, so really applying the texture manually really starts to enable you to see what kind of textures work and what don't. I think it does help to imagine the light source, so maybe the light coming through and how it travels, how it hits certain areas, how other areas are still going to remain in shadow, so that an element like snow, for example, is going to appear like a light blue when it's slightly more in the shadow, and then where you imagine the light to break through, you're going to use more of that very white colour, and it's really going to illuminate those sections. So it's the same element, just under slightly different light conditions. You need to try and get your head around where the light's coming from in your scene, and that way you can, really understand how it's going to impact things. So I've made a decision that probably the light's going to come from this side really, because it's going to hit this side predominantly, maybe above, maybe hitting this side. So it's not quite where I imagined initially, but sometimes when you start adding texture and colour, it starts to kind of have a life of its own in a way. You want to be in control, but you also want to be responsive to the thing that you're actually creating. Sometimes it seems to nudge you in a direction that you didn't initially intend, but honestly it helps to go with it that sometimes and just work with it rather than trying to fight against that. Now I heard a famous quote by Picasso that says that you should just destroy any happy accident. So if you accidentally arrive at something that looks good, you should instantly destroy it. And don't be satisfied with a happy accident and try and recreate it yourself. Personally, I'm not quite of that school of thinking. I think if something's kind of appeared in front of you and you can learn from it and incorporate it in your piece, then I think that's a happy accident. I'm not such a purist that I feel the need to destroy it instantly and start again. But each to their own. So I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to use this layer now, and I'm going to still stick with the colours of the mountaintops, but I'm going to create an effect perhaps where as we get lower down in the mountain range, perhaps we've got some low-lying mist, perhaps some atmospheric elements that's breaking up the darker tones there. So I'm going to use the lighter blue. I'm going to change to my soft brush. I'm going to increase the size of the brush and turn the opacity pretty low for this. because I want to bring in the effect but not have it be too sudden or too strong. And it's important it's on a different layer because I'm probably going to continue to add some detail into the bottom area of the mountain range. Not for every single element of it, because quite a good chunk of it is going to be obscured by trees. But anywhere where it just shows through a little bit, I want to make sure that I can go back in there and just fine tune any little details that I'm not satisfied with. But I just wanted to create a general effect of a kind of atmospheric element there at the bottom. So that will do initially for the mountain range in the distance. Like I say, I probably will return to it, but for now, I'm going to leave that where it is. And I'm going to use the bottom range of colours now. And again, I'm going to switch to my medium airbrush. I'm going to go to my darkest colour here, which is pretty much black there. It happens to be in the colour, in the sort of blue spectrum. And I also have a dark green. I'm going to use the black. Having said that, I'm not going to use it on full opacity. So I guess the way that I'm using it isn't going to be fully black anyway, really. But I've chosen a black colour anyway. And I'm going to start piecing in where I want the trees to be. So they're going to be a lot of pine trees, I guess. So maybe a couple of tall ones. See, the problem is now that you're going to end up being quite reluctant to put trees in front of areas where perhaps you've got a detail that you're enjoying or you like the result of. Sometimes you have to be a little bit brutal and be prepared to destroy what you've created. But I think in this instance, I'm going to avoid that section. I want that section to show through. So perhaps I'll do more of a cluster in this area and more of a cluster in this area. The good thing about working digitally is that if you decide you're not happy with that, you can always move them around and piece them somewhere where they work better anyway. But for now, we're going to move forward as if that's not an option. So I'm just creating some tree trunks. So I'm planning where I'm going to put the trees and imagining some trees in the distance. So when I'm doing a tree that's moving further forward, I'm going to do the base of the trunk lower down, and when it's further in the distance, it's going to be when you're not really able to see that horizon line anymore, but we know it's sort of roughly there. I'll put it back in just for a guide. So when something's in the distance, it's more likely to grow from that horizon line, and it'll be smaller, it'll be shorter, it won't reach as high up. When it's nearer to you, it's going to start below that horizon line, and the chances are it's going to extend higher up into the scene as well. So I'm just creating a series of lines really, just to give me a sense of where things might start to stack up. They don't have to be terribly neat at this point, I'm just getting an idea of where to put things. So I'm going to turn the opacity up a little bit, so I'm going to use this black to start piecing in some suggestion of the leaves now. So I'm going to use pretty much a kind of zigzagging motion now to create the sense of branches. So I'm not doing it as a line. I'm doing it more as a series of broken texture like this. And I'll just keep swinging the motion backwards and forwards as I go. So I'm creating quite loose, quite abstract shapes and forms, but I'm just going in that kind of a motion. So I am being quite mindful of keeping the branches generally pointing upwards, certainly at the top of the tree. As branches get lower down, you might find that they straighten up somewhat, but certainly towards the top of this tree, they're going to more point upwards, they're going to fan out wider near the bottom and perhaps level out a little bit. Depends on the type of tree, but for my trees, that's going to be the general rule. Now this is more of a background for the tree elements, and I'm going to do quite a lot of these. So you're going to have to be patient and spend the time doing these. But to be fair, if you imagined that picking up art, doing artistic things was going to be a quick process, I'm afraid you're mistaken in a lot of cases. I've found that if you don't love the process, then don't bother, because it takes many hours. Takes a lot of work. You have to enjoy the hours that you're going to put into it, and I really do. So I've got the patience to spend the time putting in these shapes, putting in the texture. In actual fact, some of my full paintings, I've spent many hours fine-tuning the kind of details that probably, certainly not many people are going to look at. Most people, when they glance at a painting, they might zoom in a little bit, look at a couple of details, and then they move on. But some of my paintings, I've spent so long on them that I'm not sure how many people are truly going to benefit from that level of detail. But it's about whether you enjoy it, I think, in a lot of cases. If you don't enjoy working on it, then I don't know. I don't want to discourage people, but maybe find something that you do actually enjoy spending your time doing, because art is a very time-consuming pastime, and I don't see the purpose of doing it unless you're actually going to enjoy putting in the hours. So I'm going to do them in the background too. Maybe press on a little bit less in the background so they're not quite as dense. Be a little less careful about them in the background, doesn't really matter as much. Like I say, this is a background element anyway. There's going to be more colours that I'm going to add on top of these, but I definitely need a base of dark tone so that then when I add other lighter colours like greens over the top of them, it's going to feel like it has different layers and depths to the colours. In some ways I quite like the way it appears like this. It's a bit like a snowy landscape, quite a bleak kind of snowy environment with hills in the background, but that's not going to be the end result. We're going to have quite a lot of green coming into this. So I'm putting in the groundwork, putting in the time. I've explained the process, zigzagging backwards and forwards, but also maintaining a kind of broken, rough look to it as well. So I'm just going to get on with these and then we'll pick back up once I've done a few more of them. I can be quite happy to just fill in some areas where I'm going to get very dense with the trees. There's going to be next to no light coming through in some of the areas. It's not a problem. You want to make it that bit darker. Again, it's just the background. This isn't the finished look. I do intend to do more tutorials. I've been a little bit delayed in my intentions to do this because I'm currently in the process of moving house and renovating a house, so it's an enormous amount of work, and in all honesty my life is in quite a lot of chaos at the moment. But it is my intention to do some more detail kind of tutorials where I really focus perhaps on a tree element or a rock element or a texture element and look at those in more detail. But I haven't had time to do much of that yet, but that is certainly my intention moving forward. Okay, like I said, that's quite rough, but it doesn't matter because I'm going to create another layer now, and I'm going to go to my darkest green colours, and I'm going to use that, just turn the size of the brush up a little bit, and I'm going to use that to start to bulk out some of the areas to create just some denser foliage in some bits, because those initial dark lines are great for a starting point, but they're completely black. There's no sense of colour or depth in them, so by going over this now with some of that green, just keeping it quite patchy, again moving with the general form, but I can bulk it out, make it a little denser here and there. I'm not going to bother with the bottom areas just yet because I'm probably going to have some real foreground, shorter tree elements there to cover that over anyway. So I'm going to concentrate some of this really near the top parts of the trees. So I'm just starting to add more blobs of this green just to give it a little bit more variety of colour to begin with. This is still the darkest tones. We're going to keep working back over this with a variety of lighter greens too, so you need to just start to build in your texture of colour. So again, it's not on full opacity, so we're getting a combination of the black and the green kind of merging together here, so you get the double impact of both of those. It's okay to close down some of the gaps there. So I'm just moving across these. Started on the top elements being smaller blobs, but maybe I can just create a slightly diluted version of that green, just going over these and more of a kind of scribbling. Okay, so I've done that green. I'm going to create another layer. I prefer to keep them separate as layers, then I can really just change one element at a time. So I'm going to the next green along, and I'm going to focus this green, perhaps turn the opacity up, size the brush down a little bit. I'm just going to focus more of this green towards the edge of the trees. In fact, I'm going to skip that green. I'm going to move along to the real vibrant green here. I can always go back and add some of those subtle greens, but it's just not having the powerful impact that I would have anticipated at this stage. So I'm going to reserve this for some of the edges of this tree. Now remember, I've mainly got the sunlight coming from this side, so I'm going to show a big impact of the light on this side of the trees. It's going to probably appear on both to an extent, but a little bit more on this side of all the trees. So I'm keeping it quite broken again. Maybe there's some bits that the end of the branches, you can just see some texture on the, or some light impacting on the end of those. Maybe there's some areas where all this green, could always turn the size of the brush up and the opacity down. Maybe it starts to cluster together a little bit more. Bear in mind, I've got even lighter greens that I can go over this too. Again, so I'm just going to reserve some of this green for this edge of the tree, just to add some highlights onto this part of it. So a little bit across the centre, but more of a concentration on that half of the tree. So all the other elements that I've added so far are still there, but I'm adding some foreground elements. So all the branches and the foliage that goes in front of it over the top now is now pushing it back a little bit, and so we're having more focus on these parts of the tree. So it creates a real sense that there's lots of stuff going on there within the tree. I can even add some more trees, some shorter ones in here now within this section. So again, I'm going to concentrate the light on more one edge, or around the edges of that tree, maybe a little bit in the center. So if I create another one here, I'm going to concentrate on that half of it, a little bit on that side, maybe just a few broken shapes in the center there as well. So I'll do like maybe a middle-sized one here. Turn the opacity up a little bit so you can really see this. So some broken sort of texture here running along the side of that tree, a little bit less on the other side, maybe just perhaps it encroaches across the middle section too, here and there. Now I do have some even lighter greens, so I'm going to use those. I need to turn the opacity down a little bit because this is really going to be quite bright. So I can use this now just a bit more sparingly along the edges of some of these, just to really pick out a sense that it's really illuminating that kind of edge of that tree. So you need to use this a little bit more sparingly. You don't just want to cover over the greens that you've already created, so it's not going in exactly the same areas. Maybe use it a little bit more broken than the other greens that you've already put. Again, I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to create another layer, mainly because I want to start adding some of the land here before I move on to any other elements. So I'm going to go back to one of my dark greens here, and I'm just going to use this to start to piece in a sense of some greenery here at the bottom as well. In fact, instead of that green, I'm going to go even darker because I don't like that colour. Go for the very darkest green. I think that'll be a better colour at this stage. Turn the opacity up. In fact, I'm going to put this layer underneath the trees even. So it goes underneath the trees, and again I'm going to use this dark green just to build out some of the land here where the trees are actually stood. And I'm going to move along to my other colours, and I'm going to start creating some tufts, maybe some bands across here. Turn the opacity of it down, create some grassy areas here, some broken sort of tufts, round shapes. I'm going to create another layer, going to put it on top because that was okay for the background, but there are some details now that I want to bring forwards. So for example, I might want to do some mounds of grass in this area. Like so. Again, I'm going to move to some of my other colors here. So I've got a kind of almost a kind of yellowy green, add some different kind of tones into the mix here, almost like straw-like colors, maybe some grass that is a little bit more dried out. So maybe just a few sort of strands and suggestions of things sticking up at the top there. Just break it in a kind of upward movement. So you're not seeing individual blades of grass so much as just the general movement of your brush marks is going in the direction of the subject matter itself. It gives the impression rather than individual blades of grass. Use my real vibrant green here, add some more elements. So the sunlight's coming in from here, maybe it's going to illuminate this section a little bit more because it's got greater access to it, fewer trees. So what at this stage I'm going to do is I'm going to merge all the layers. I can 3 fingers down, click on the layer, I can copy. I can then go back on my layers, 2 finger backwards, opens out all my layers again, 3 fingers down, paste. And what I've pasted on top is a condensed version of everything. So if I move that around now, you can see I can move all of the condensed layers, but at the same time, I've still got all the other layers there free. So what I'm going to do with that layer is I'm going to click on here. I'm going to flip it vertically. Just zoom out a little bit so you can see it. I'm going to go down. I'm going to have a go at creating the reflected scene now. So I'm going to put it about there. In fact, before I do that, I'm going to try that again. I'm going to reduce it down. I've had to zoom out here so you can see the full kind of thing that I'm doing. I'm going to squash it down slightly. What tends to happen is you get a slightly condensed version of your reflection than you do at the top half. So I've squished it together a little bit like that. So there's some bits of that I'm not very happy with. So I'll just go and delete the little bits that don't quite work. So I'm reducing back some of those elements like so. And to be honest, for the whole of that layer, I'm going to create a bit of a blur to it. So I've gone on Gaussian blur. I'm going to, as you can see, just blur it out a little bit, not too much. I just want it to appear slightly less crystal clear and in focus. And what I'm going to do is create another layer. I'm going to use the color that I've got here at the end on this new layer with my medium brush. I want to create a little bit of a separation between the reflection and the actual land. So I want to create a little bit of, not quite a sand bank, but certainly a little bit of the land at the edge of the water here. Like that. I can then go back to my darkest green, maybe just fine tune some of this bottom of the land just so it meets that a little bit more on the edge as well. Perhaps I want the grass to go right in the water there as well. I could just use this to fine tune it a little bit, decide which bits I want to be right on the water's edge there. If I want to subdue the reflection a little bit, then I can go over that, make it a little less bright. So another thing I'm going to do to that reflection is I'm going to go onto my smudge tool, but instead of using the soft airbrush, I've gone onto the turpentine brush here, and I'm going to just play around with the size of the brush and the opacity of it, and I'm going to use some large sweeping motions. I want pretty much straight lines to go across, and I'm just disturbing that water. I want quite a sort of, a little bit more of a grainy texture to this anyway, more lines than just the normal soft airbrush. So I can reduce the size of the brush and the opacity up. If I want to break it up even more. If you want to create the sense that the ripples are closer to here, you can leave a slightly bigger gap, and then as they get towards the top, you're really going to get a complete sort of breaking down of that texture here. The extent to which you do this is entirely up to you. If you wanted to go back over it and use some of the colours, so if you wanted some of that green, you could easily then just go back into that and just exaggerate some of the green in some of these areas just to bring out some of those details back in if you wanted. But it gives you a good starting point to start thinking about the break and the texture that's in the water there. Now what you might also want to do is there's going to be some sort of ripples and things that might just be not typically a straight reflection. There might just be some bands where it ripples in a different way and catches the light a little bit more. So I'm just using this soft airbrush, just using some kind of dashes to break it up a little bit more. Again, if you wanted to use a darker colour too, it works both ways. So you could introduce some more of the black sort of tones into certain details and certain areas, just as much as you can the lighter colours. Have it interrupt a little bit more. So really it's kind of a reflection of the colours here, but if you wanted to break into that a little bit more, then you can do. Equally with dark and light tones. So in terms of the cloud, I didn't add this colour before, but I've got a grey now that I've added to, but I'm also going to use the white. So I'm going to use predominantly the white. I'm not going to go too into detail with the cloud. I just want to add a suggestion of clouds here and there, but not much. But maybe just some tufts that are coming into the sky here a little bit here and there. But fundamentally it's quite a clear day, I think, in this particular scene. Then in terms of the grey, I'm really going to turn the opacity down for this. I don't want to overkill that grey at all. I don't want to make them look like storm clouds. I'm just going to add just a hint that there might be some mass to these and they have a slightly kind of shadowed area, but not too much. Now some of my other tutorials, I spent a bit longer on the clouds, but I just wanted to give a slight suggestion, not have a totally empty sky here. So these are by no means the most complex clouds that I've ever done, and I've certainly done even more complex ones on my other tutorials. So it's worth looking through my playlist if you want better examples of how I can do clouds, or how I've shown you how to do clouds, I should say. But there you go. I'm not even going to feature them really on the reflection at all. I could carry on fine-tuning this, and certainly if it was something that I was going to present as a finished piece of work, I mean it kind of is a finished piece of work, but you know what I'm saying. If I was going to hang it on my wall or I was going to present it as my best example work, I would spend longer fine-tuning these details. So if you're following this example, I hope that it's helped give you a sense of the overall structure, and it's enabled you to think you can do this a little bit more effectively than you could before. You've just learned one or two techniques. Then you can apply it to your own paintings. Spend as many hours as you want fine-tuning those all-important little details, and I hope this has been useful. Please do check out my other playlists. Take a wander over to my Patreon page if you fancy that. All the links for those kind of things are down in the description. Do remember to subscribe and come back here. I plan to do loads more tutorials like this. I already have a lot of tutorials like this and I have no intention of stopping. Thanks very much for watching. I shall catch you back here soon. See you later.